Well, Ross, thank you very much for a wide-ranging and informative paper. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for questions to Ross. Can I emphasise we won't be taking any statements. We are only interested in questions. We've had all the statements we need so far. But Ross, I might get things rolling by asking you a question about the two case studies you used, the United States and China. To my ears, at least, it seemed that you described a political system that was struggling to come to terms with this diabolical policy problem, that of the United States, and was muddling its way forward. And then you moved on to talk about a system that was coping what really sounded like quite efficiently with the problem. You've just come back from the United States and China. Do you think China is going to be able to better cope with this problem? And will this be the area where China emerges to global leadership?
Well, the Chinese political system does find it easier quickly to change course, to take decisions that confront special interests in what the leadership considers to be the national interest. So China does have some advantages. There are also some quite large disadvantages in the Chinese political system, and so I never would feel comfortable about comparison of the two systems' capacity to deal with one particular problem as suggestive of some general advantage. There is a danger that the political systems of the democratic West will be seen amongst people who are making up their minds about choice of systems to not only on this issue, but on a lot of other big issues of the contemporary world, financial regulation, provision of infrastructure in large cities, to not really be able to face up to their problems. There is a danger that our type of political system, which I think is the best of all possible systems, will be judged unfavourably. I think that would be very unfair, because our political system and the American political system don't have to perform as badly as they have done recently on this issue.
Thanks, Ross.
Anthony Hobley, I'm the Global Head of Climate Change and Carbon Finance International Law Firm Norton Rose. Two questions. There's a debate going on in The Economist at the moment about whether you lock in sort of transitionary technologies like gas and whether that's actually bad in the long run. I'd be interested, you mentioned that, interested in your view on that. And secondly, William Hague was here a couple of weeks ago, the British Foreign Secretary, and he made a number of really interesting points. And I've seen this when I was back in the UK in December. The UK is really looking to the sort of green economy, the low carbon economy, as a way to get itself out of this sort of economic crisis. And the UK is a democracy like North America and Australia, but has been one of the first countries to enact a whole range of policies. And he was pretty much praising the first mover position taken by the UK under the Labour government. So there was this sort of continuity from Labour to effectively the Conservatives. With a sort of effectively a green revolution led by China that's taking place across Asia, do you see Australia effectively leaving itself out of that huge economic advantage which the UK is pursuing very aggressively?
Yeah, two questions. In the very detailed modelling that I did for the original review, some of it with the Australian Treasury, we looked very carefully at the economically optimal transitions, and there was a large place for gas in that transition. While the costs of other technologies are coming down, there is an advantage, in, especially in a country like Australia, emerging as the world's biggest exporter of gas, not having to carry the large costs of liquefaction and transport of gas, which our customers in Northeast Asia have to carry. There is a large advantage for Australia in using gas as a lower emission fossil fuel for some time. The modelling showed that there comes a time when gas, like coal, runs into difficulty without carbon capture and storage. In the quite short-term future, the prospects of expansion of gas of coal-based generation depend on success with carbon capture and storage, or some alternative mechanism for absorbing the waste of combustion of carbon. Gas will eventually face that. In any economically efficient system, the price of emissions will be rising over time. There will come a time when that puts pressure on gas. But even knowing that, the modelling showed that in an optimal transition, there's quite a large place for replacing coal by gas for a considerable period. And then William Hague's point about the leadership in the green economy. Our economic structure and our economic interests are not exactly the same as China's or Britain's or Germany's or Japan's or Korea's or America's. We are likely in the lower carbon global economy of the future to have the same basic advantage as we have in the high carbon economy of the past, and that is access to low cost energy. It's not very likely that in the near future we will emerge as a major supplier of capital goods to the low emissions industries. And when William Hague talks, when Barack Obama talks, when Jiabao talks about the advantages of being in front of the pack, what's on top of their mind is to be the first countries producing efficiently the capital goods. And already some developed countries have made big industries out of that. For example, Denmark and Germany, an export of highly efficient wind-based capital goods for wind power. So we don't have that interest that Britain has, that Japan has, that others have, and one day we might. But given our potential strengths still for low-cost generation of energy, it's more likely that our advantages will come through effective utilization of a different set of low-cost energy sources. Now, there are advantages in being ahead of that game. Our modelling showed that with a rising carbon price sufficiently to reflect the social cost of carbon, that Australia very quickly loses any advantage it has had in the past in aluminium smelting because it's based on coal. But the advantage reappears later on if we play our cards right, because we are a low-cost supplier of alternative energies. If people have confidence, if investors have confidence, if business has confidence that that later stage will be there, that we are investing in the innovation that will bring through these lower cost technologies, it's less likely that we'll go through an unnecessary adjustment, a winding down of some of the energy intensive industries that are not competitive for a while, but which have prospects for being competitive again in different circumstances at a later date.
Professor Garnaut, Kevin Morrison from Argus Media. Can you just explain what's changed politically at a domestic level from your 2008 report, so when you handed it in at the end of the day, when push came to shove, the Prime Minister of the day parked emissions policy to the side. What's going to happen this time, or what do you see has changed if things do get tough politically again, that the present government will push emissions policy to the side yet again?
Well, I don't pretend any expertise in political analysis of that kind. I've been asked to do some additional work on what makes good sense for Australia in the Australian national interest. But one thing I think that has changed in the last couple of years is that quite a few Australians think that we didn't end up in a very good place last time. I'm expecting, I'm certainly hoping that that realization, including in major parts of business, that it's not sensible for Australia to continue with a jerky ad hoc approach to mitigation, where we're actually adding quite a lot to cost, but without doing very much to reduce emissions. I think there's a fair bit of realisation that's not an optimal path for us. So what I'm hoping is that we will have an opportunity in the rest of this year to focus analytically on the real consequences of doing things in different ways, the real consequences of using economically efficient as distinct from ad hoc and costly approaches to mitigation. What the Australian polity decided last year is that governments are not going to be able to walk away from this issue. We will be in the game of mitigation. The question is whether we will be doing this in an economically and environmentally efficient way or not. And my work will seek to define and I hope to explain effectively the economically and environmentally efficient approaches.
Jeff Miller at the back.
Thank you. Really just a technical question. How long do you think it will be before carbon capture and storage is in effective real-world use as opposed to being part of research projects in Australia?
Yeah, well, it's already being put on a very large scale in the Gorgon natural gas project, Jeff. It's possibly the largest carbon capture and storage project in the past. Up until then, when you produce natural gas, a lot of carbon dioxide comes out with the gas. From our high school chemistry, we know that you can't turn carbon dioxide into a liquid. So as you liquefy the natural gas, the carbon dioxide is vented. You wouldn't want to carry it all the way to Shanghai or Tokyo, even if you could turn it into a liquid. So you've got to do something with it. In the past, it's been vented. It's been, at Gorgon, and this is a result of regulation by the West Australian state government. They said you can't do this project unless you capture and sequester the emissions. They're re-injecting it into the structures from which it came. And there's quite a few % of Australian emissions involved in that single decision. So it's already working on being put into effect on a commercial scale. A very big question and it's important that we continue in those sorts of situations to take advantage of opportunities to avoid what in the past has been a major source of fugitive emissions. But the big question is when will it become economically efficient to, on a large scale, sequester the waste from the carbon dioxide waste from coal combustion, this is the commercialisation of new technologies is a question involving great uncertainty. Whenever a business is introducing a new technology, there are huge risks on being the first one to apply it on a commercial scale. Now, the minimum scale of economically efficient operation of carbon capture and storage for carbon combustion waste is very large. The opportunity in Bass Strait and Gippsland, where you have one of the most concentrated sources of carbon dioxide, the dirty coal of the Latrobe Valley, not very far from what on all accounts are some of the best geosequestration sites on Earth. If it's going to work anywhere in the world, it's quite likely to work there, but the scale of making it work is very large, and it's very unlikely that a single business would take the risks on that. And so this will be a question on which governments will need to put in place general systems of support for research, development and commercialisation of new technologies, for innovation. The first people to make commercial scale carbon capture and storage work will teach a lot to everyone else. They will certainly make mistakes, costly mistakes. the first user of any new technology always does. That's why it's a cliche of business. You don't want to be the first company to do any new thing, introduce any new technology, certainly in the engineering area. So we might get our first commercial plants for carbon capture and storage from coal combustion at about the time when we've got an economically efficient system of public support for innovation in Australia.
Gentleman just here.
Martin Wilder. Professor Garnaut, one of the questions, there's a lot of talk at the moment about an international price per carbon, yet if you take what you described as the messy approach, where different countries are developing different regimes, how do you get to an international price of carbon? So, for example, the Europeans have made it quite clear they won't accept forestry carbon, which is a prime avenue of carbon offset under the CFI. And then we have, with the CDM, the split with HFC 23 credits. How do you, in that more messy approach which you've been describing, get an international price of carbon?
That's the big problem, the biggest problem, the messy approach. I can see the free rider problem possibly being resolved by in a repeated game of everyone watching what everyone else is doing and gradually upgrading their effort. But without firm targets, then you don't have a basis for economically and environmentally efficient trade in entitlements. So, and Australia would get very large benefits from access to that international trade. So it's why I emphasised the importance of keeping in mind the long-term goal of such an agreement as a basis for international trade. Now, there will be some quite large parts of the world with a real carbon price, like Europe. Now, Europe will be able to trade at its price on rules that it determines. And so that will be the centre of some trading opportunities. There's discussion in New Zealand, which already has an operating ETS, of linking to the European scheme, for example. For Australia, where these opportunities are so large, it's worth outputting a fair bit of effort into, as an interim measure, prior to the establishment of a multilateral system of entitlements, of binding entitlements, for Australia, putting effort into seeing whether it can build an economically and environmentally efficient regional system for trade in entitlements.
Gentleman just here at the front.
I have seen reported you mentioning about changes of lifestyle and reduction of meat consumption in the Western world, which is quite excessive. But this aspect does not get much airing in the media and elsewhere, although it is a very important aspect for sustainability of food supply for increasing world population. Can you please comment on this aspect?
Yes, in my original review, and I haven't had reason to change my mind, I took the view that we will not get a result, or at least we won't get an acceptable result, if it depends on asking any of the communities on Earth to accept a radically reduced standard of living. The key to success in this endeavour is going to be breaking the nexus between living standards and high emissions. And the review showed that there are ways of doing that. We won't get there rapidly without an awful lot of innovation. And so the two instruments that are really important in Australia and elsewhere will be a carbon price and support for innovation. But I think that realistically, for good or ill, that has to be the path, rather than asking the richer people of the world to consume much less, because they're not likely to do so.
Gentleman just at the back.
Good afternoon, Professor Garnaut. Matthew Knott from Crikey. You talked at the end of your presentation about the influence Australia can have on other countries' progress. But as you mentioned in the paper, Australia's pledges at Copenhagen were largely conditional on what other countries do, with only a unilateral target of 5%. Do you think that's appropriate for Australia to base their targets on what other nations do, or is that just putting us in the passenger seat?
I think we take a big step forward if we contribute proportionately, because we up till now we've been contributing much less than proportionately. So the first step is to get Australia up to what other countries are doing on some sort of average, not picking the worst performer in the rest of the world and comparing ourselves with that, but honestly and objectively reviewing what would be a proportionate position from Australia's part. So at the moment, or up till now, certainly through the last 10 years, Australia's been a significant drag on the global effort. We would cease to be a drag if we came up to an average sort of effort. So don't knock that. Stopping being a drag is a big step forward for Australia. A second point is, if we're doing something that's proportionate in relation to the world as a whole, we might be helpful to our friends in North America in arguing the case for their succeeding in doing what their governments want to do. Thirdly, and this is an area which I emphasise, but I think there's real opportunity for leadership by Australia, and that is that if we can find economically and environmentally efficient ways of reducing emissions, then putting those in place will carry their own arguments for others to do things in a similar way. And the more we can reduce the costs of a certain amount of mitigation, the more ambitious that our communities will be prepared to be about mitigation. So I think us doing it right with an economy-wide price on carbon, with efficient support for innovation, could turn out to be a very important contribution of leadership to the international system.
Gentleman just here at the side.
Tony Moore from the Australian Conservation Foundation. In your 2008 review, you made recommendations that Australia should place conditions on its targets, or our proportional effort. Some of those conditions weren't just about how much was actually being done by the countries, but what level of international progress was being made. The Australian government had its own more elaborate set of conditions. Do you, in this sort of strong, messy world, see a cause or a reason to revise those conditions, perhaps be a little bit more lenient of the situation in the US, of the level of progress that's happening in different nations outside of the UN?
Yeah, well, certainly that's something I'm looking at, Tony, and if the evidence is there that on average countries are doing something that would justify a larger effort than the -5, then the Australian government's own commitment at Copenhagen carries some implications. I'll be discussing all of that, but I think it's a really important step for Australia to put in place some efficient mechanisms for starting to move forward. We're talking about pledges of emissions reduction by 2020. The Australian community will feel more comfortable about more ambitious pledges once we've started a process. And so in my final advice on pricing of carbon, obviously I'll have to say something about where we sit proportionally and the implications of that for pricing of carbon. But I'll very much have in mind the importance of making the sort of start that we haven't been able to make up till now.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid, sorry to those who didn't get to ask a question, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Ross, thank you for a rich and broad-ranging discussion today. There are certainly some reasons for sober policy analysis in what you had to say, but there's also reasons for some hopeful elements in what you had to say. So this is surely going to be one of the political issues of this year. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Ross Garnaut.